time. The Honourable Wilson Tucker.
Thank you, Acting President. I would like to take this opportunity to continue my remarks about the crisis that's facing the rental market and the need for greater protection for renters in WA. And this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart as a renter. I've certainly been on the receiving end of some, you could say, some unscrupulous landlords, and so I've certainly felt some of the pain that a lot of the renters are facing in WA. We know it is 30% of the population in WA are renting at the moment. Now, we've heard previously from our former Premier, who was the Treasurer, the Honourable Mark McGowan, who I will quickly add has taken the well-trodden and well-worn path down the hill to take up a very lucrative resource contract after spending his term looking after his mates for his tenure. I think that is probably a topic for another day. But the former Premier was very quick to downplay the housing crisis that we were facing in WA under his watch, and certainly under the watch of this government, and say that there's nothing to see here. In WA, we have higher than average incomes and lower than average property prices compared to the eastern states, which is a true statement. But it's also true to say, Acting President, that not everyone in WA enjoys the FIFO wages, and not everyone in WA can afford a mortgage, or indeed in some circumstances actually afford to pay rent. Now, we know with this housing crisis there's a supply issue, and it's putting downward pressure on the rental market. There's less rental properties available, which is driving up prices. And in some circumstances, it's driving people out the other end. They're basically getting spat out the other end into homelessness and onto the ever-growing social housing wait list. Now, there is a housing spectrum, and affordable housing is on that spectrum. And when that affordable housing becomes unaffordable, then that's where we've got a problem. And that's exactly what we're seeing in WA with that ever-growing homelessness number and the ever-growing social housing waitlist number. And this statement about the affordable housing becoming unaffordable is actually backed up by a recent report by Anglicare Australia called the Rental Affordability Snapshot 2023. And members, I encourage you to read it. The reports, the findings of this report are quite damning. It found that 0% of properties were affordable for a single person on a job seeker. 1% of available properties were affordable for people on other income support payments. And at the time of that report, there were only 2,912 rental properties available in WA. Now, given the size of WA, just under 3,000 properties is a very small number. And if we look at the Perth property market right now, I think it's operating at about 0.1%, which is the tightest in the country, and it's clearly not working as expected. It also found that available rentals dropped 16% compared to 2022, and very telling, members, the WA median property price for rental was $560 per week, which is obviously very expensive, and that has put the affordability of a rental property out of reach for pretty much every household on some level of income support, which I just outlined, and also anyone on the minimum wage as well. So a large section of the population can actually afford this to actually participate in the rental market. Now, given we have 30% of West Australians renting, and there was a report that I mentioned in the chamber last week, which was commissioned by the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, which actually found that it was basically a third, 30%, 30%, 30%, basically sort of similar to that split. It found that young Australians, so a third of young Australians, couldn't afford a property in the next 5 years. And then a third didn't think that they could afford to put a mortgage and own a property in the next 5 to 10 years. And then very, very alarming and very distressingly, a third didn't think they could afford a property ever. They couldn't envision a reality where they could actually afford to break out of this rental spiral that they find themselves in. Now, we know that there is some reform coming in WA, and I've spoken previously. I think there are some good bits in the reform that the Minister for Commerce has outlined. However, there is one piece that is missing that renters want the most, and it is essentially the elephant in the room that is being ignored by the WA government, and that is removing no grounds evictions. Now, I asked some questions to the Minister last week, really around the basis for the government's position on not scrapping no grounds evictions. The Minister did provide me some very fulsome answers, and I appreciate the responses. I didn't necessarily like the content of those answers, but they were fulsome nonetheless. Now, the Minister pointed to a report commissioned by Bankwest called the Housing Affordability in Western Australia Report 2023. It is a good report, and I'm going to read from that because the wording here is important. So the report says, reforms designed to aid tenants might, and might is a very operative word here, have the opposite effect if supply were to contract even further. So members, this report is basically stating the obvious here. So if you give renters more rights and landlords and property owners feel like they don't have the responsibility, the ownership over that property, then potentially you might spook investors from investing in the property market. The end result is less supply, you drive up prices and you make the situation worse. So this report isn't a glowing endorsement of the government's position. It doesn't back the government's policy on this. It's stating the absolute obvious here and saying you might result in a tighter rental market as a result. Now, the report goes on and says a thorough assessment of the reforms that would deliver a private rental system equitable for both tenants and landlords is required. So members, this report isn't a thorough assessment. It's saying a thorough assessment is required. Now, I asked questions last week, and I'll ask it again. Minister, if you do have a thorough assessment, or your department or this government has done a thorough assessment as evidence for the basis of your position to not scrap no grounds evictions, I personally would be very interested in that assessment. I did find a report that is more of a thorough assessment as opposed to this report, the Bankwest report, and it again is by the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, and it's called The Regulation of Residential Tenancies and Impacts on Investment. And this report is actually peer-reviewed as well. And this report looked at two jurisdictions who underwent recent rental reform, and that was New South Wales and Victoria. And I'm not going to bore you with the details, members. The report is publicly available, but it summarises its findings by saying the analysis supports the characterisation of Australian tenancy law as accommodating of landlords. While the prospect of reforms may cause some would-be investors to pause, the analysis does not support the contention that tenancy law reforms have caused landlords to disinvest. And it goes on, when investors decide to invest, prospective rental income and capital gains are the most important considerations, but tenancy laws are an important consideration too. On the other hand, tenancy laws do not figure strongly in reasons for disposing of investment properties. So it's saying, in short, members, that rental tenancy reform is a consideration for landlords, absolutely, but there are bigger macro factors that come into play. And for an investor, it's capital gains, it's negative gearing, it's property growth. They are the main considerations that come into play when a landlord is looking to invest and put their house into the rental market pool, as opposed to those tenancy reforms that potentially would spook investors. Even more telling, members, so when we look at no grounds evictions, So the no grounds eviction is actually a small proponent of tenancy law. So it's a small subset of a small consideration for investors. And in reality, landlords are only exercising their right to use no grounds evictions actually in only 5% of cases. So majority of landlords actually have a legitimate reason, and they'll list the reason to evict someone when a fixed term contract expires, and they're only using no grounds evictions in 5% of cases. So in reality, what we're finding is that landlords don't actually care about no grounds evictions at all. But tenants actually care a lot. And there's a survey that was conducted by the Make Renting Fair Alliance in 2023, and what they found, there was some interesting finding, members. One of the key findings was, I'll just read directly from this survey: renters feel powerless to negotiate rent increases, mostly due to the fear of no reason, no ground evictions. And the survey goes on to say the threat of a no reason eviction hangs over negotiations between tenants and landlords about unfair rent increases. Due to the record low vacancy rate and current tenancy laws permitting evictions without grounds, real estate agents and landlords can easily replace tenants, creating a significant power imbalance and persuasive insecurity for tenants. Now, the survey found that in 41% of the cases, renters tried to negotiate their rent increase but were refused, and 41% actually didn't even ask, with the most common reason being that they felt they were at risk of losing the lease and not being able to find another property. So if they didn't feel like they had a reasonable seat at the negotiating table, and if they raised any concerns, if they rocked the boat, then they'll find themselves essentially out on the street, because that is a reality that a lot of renters will find, given this, in Perth, the 0.1% availability rate of renters, and the fact you have hundreds of people rocking up to a home open every day. And then lastly, 17% were able to negotiate for a very modest rate. So 17% of cases, successful outcome, but just under half didn't feel like they had provision to actually raise their concern around the rent increase because of the fear of this metaphorical axe in the form of a no grounds eviction termination hanging over their head. There's also, so that survey was conducted using a sample size of actual renters. If you look at the broader population, there is strong support for terminating no grounds evictions as well. 71% of West Australians support removing no grounds evictions. And as I said, members, it's only 5% of cases where landlords are actually using no grounds evictions. I think the only people that actually care about no grounds evictions are real estate agents or a lot of property managers backed by REWA, who seem to have a very strong and potentially influential lobby group. They're the only ones that want this provision retained. Landlords don't care, and tenants definitely want it scrapped. And the wider public also wants it removed. Acting President, there was some commentary at National Cabinet around this. There was some agreement on some general guidelines around protection for renters. The majority of the states have actually supported this, except for WA when it comes to no grounds evictions. So there were a number of principles that were put forward by National Cabinet. Majority of states and territories have signed on to these guidelines, and one of them was genuine grounds evictions, which makes total sense. WA is one of the only states, along with Northern Territory, that are digging their heads in the sand and backing no grounds evictions without any evidence or data to back up their claim that removing no grounds evictions will actually de-incentivise investment in the market. Now, we also heard an announcement last week as well by, I believe it was the Deputy Premier, basically saying that one of the reasons why WA was retaining no grounds evictions was the short-term stay, was Airbnb. Now, this feels like, to me, an absolute red herring. We heard from the Minister for Commerce around this Bankwest report. Then we heard from the Deputy Premier around we don't want to spook the investment market, and we're using Airbnb and short-term rental as that reason. If we remove no grounds evictions, then potentially landlords will then go off and take their property out of the rental market and make it available for short-term stay. I can't see any evidence for that position. I haven't found any for related to the Bankwest report. If the minister does have any basis for the government's position on this, I am waiting, and I'm very interested to hear more.